everyone. Welcome back to the AP Lawyers Family and Divorce Law Podcast. Today, we're talking about one of the hardest and yet most empowering decisions a person can make, and that's living a relationship that no longer serves you. My guest, Julie Barth, knows that courage well. She's a mother of six, an author, trauma survivor, and founder of CJB Outreach. Julie, thank you so much for joining me. And why don't we start with your story? Take us back to the time when you first realized that something had to change in your life.
My story's kind of long. I will try and give you the bullet points. I ended up in my 20s marrying my grammar school sweetheart. We met back up at a bar after graduating college and immediately just felt this connection. It was almost like I lost that part of me that I didn't even was missing. And we had our first son, moved back to the suburbs, and proceeded to have our second child. And where the first one was, really almost a surprise, the second one was harder to come by. We had had a couple of miscarriages, so it was really 40 weeks. She just wouldn't grow in utero. So
Oh,
I was back and forth to specialists, where no one could tell us what was wrong. They kept telling us that something was wrong. And so, as a pregnant woman, it's bad enough when someone comes to you and tells you what's going on, because at least then you can research it and do something about it. But it was more that they would just like throw things out like, well, we know she's going to be sick. They thought she had trisomy 18. And then when that wasn't a thing, then they said she had a syndrome and wouldn't be able to breathe and wouldn't make it. So after about 37 weeks of just terrible, the ultrasounds looked fine. So we just had to go on blind faith and hope that it was nothing. But when she came out, she was only about 3 pounds, and they thought she was going to be closer to about 8 pounds. So they weren't prepared for her, which led to a whole bunch of, unintentional damage, a lot of malpractice, a lot of hiding. So that was really, captivated our late 20s. But once we got her onto the road of recovery, my husband, who by then we had two more children, so there were four, and he was a trader down at the Board of Trade in Chicago. And he just started being really disconnected, where once he was, he was always with the kids and playing. He just kind of was not acting himself, and he had been back and forth to the doctor. So I said, well, just go to the hospital, find out what's wrong. And within 4 hours, we found out that he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And so I was told, take him home, let him say goodbye to his children. So he actually ended up living 16 months. We got him into a trial, but I did lose him in 2000. At the time, my youngest was 18 months. My oldest was about 12. So the reason why I lead with that is after coming off of that, it was really just a decade of fire alarms and ups and downs, and just a lot of stress, a lot of grief, a lot of caregiving. After Colin, that was my husband's first name, after he died, where everyone else was just starting to grieve, because when you're not immersed in caregiving, watching somebody literally, I watched a piece of him die every day. When everyone else's grieving started, mine had hit a like I just couldn't do it anymore kind of feeling. I then met my second husband, and he was considerably younger than me, and where I almost felt as if I had been robbed of a decade of my life, caregiving and being in hospitals in and out, and really, lost my dream of wanting a big family. I saw him as the way to salvage, salvage what I wanted, go on and proceed to have the normal life. I'm putting that in quotations, that I wanted. And although, there were obvious red flags for everyone else, it just seemed like the perfect situation to me. Again, he was a lot younger than me. He was willing to have more children. And after we got together, it was, we decided to move completely away from everyone we knew, kind of leave my past in my past. And it was like I just wanted to start over and reinvent myself. I didn't want to be Julie Barth anymore. And it seemed like he was my ticket out. So then we moved, and that's when really the bottom dropped out of our relationship.
Oh, wow. Tell us a little bit first about what you mean by the bottom dropped out. What's that? 'Cause that's a pretty powerful statement there. What do you mean?
Well, I think that the reason I told my first part of the story is because I don't know that I would have gotten into the second relationship if I was not bouncing from the first and trying really just to run away from something, to put it in my past, to not deal with it. And when I met him, it was exactly what I thought I needed at the time. People ask about red flags. Well, he didn't want to hear how I was doing, where everyone else was like, slow down, take the time to grieve. I was like, nope, nope, nope. I'm ready to move on. I'm done with that. And he was just happy saying, oh, you don't want to talk about anything serious? Great, and where I thought he was giving me space and recognizing that I just wasn't prepared or ready to talk about it. He just really didn't care. But I read it differently. I read it as he was, doing it for my benefit. And it was
Mhm.
exactly what I needed. And by the time we had moved away, I was pregnant again with my fifth child, our first. And where I wanted to move away, I kind of always left this major decisions up to him. And although all of the money was mine, I was paying for everything. I kind of felt this obligation, like they're my children. He's doing me this favor. So go ahead and you can pick where we live and the house we live in. And he chose this house that was up in the mountains. And when I say up, it was literally on a mountain. We didn't really have neighbors. The neighbors that we did have were far removed. They were older, really didn't have anything in common. And where I was once in a town where, my first husband's family was large. I had, he had seven siblings. So I had, 14, a huge network of family and friends. I'd grown up in that town. I really just picked it up and left it all behind, not really recognizing that, I wanted to be alone. I thought that's exactly what I wanted. But sometimes what you actually get is not what you really think you wanted.
Mhm.
We moved to North Carolina up on this secluded mountain. And the minute we got there, it was like, I felt like, what have I done? I left everyone behind. He was not interested in my children. He was quite nasty to them. He was not interested in me at all. And where I knew that I probably had made a mistake. I was so far into it and stuck, I guess, in I'm not going home. I'm not going to tell everyone they were right. I didn't want to have the I told you so's. And I'd lost so much in a decade that I had this mission that I was not going to lose another person. And I'd probably done anything to keep that relationship together, no matter how bad it got.
Wow, that is sad to hear. So, from what I gather, it's not just a one day. Is it fair to say, was it gradual realization that you had to leave? And it wasn't just one big moment that led you to that realization. Would that be correct?
It was. After Colin died, the entire community was so good to us. They had fundraisers. They really made sure that we, were supported, and where that was very helpful and everything else. When he died, it was like I felt where when he was alive, I couldn't do anything wrong. I was this hero, I was this caregiver and this mom and selfless. And after he died, I almost felt as if I couldn't do anything right. I was almost like the beacon of sadness in this town, where I would say my name and it would already people would be like, because everyone knew our story, and it was tragic. I was either the special needs mom with this girl and she ends up having primordial dwarfism, so she does have lifetime challenges. So I was either the special needs mom and the oh poor you, or I was the widow or the woman with a chronically ill son. And everybody really did husband, they really did watch, us go through hell. So it was almost like I saw in their eyes the sadness that I was trying to avoid myself. And we had built a dream home, and I tried to rearrange it so I could still live there and stay there. And it almost felt like I was in a fishbowl. Yeah, it was not like I needed to leave. Right after he died, I did feel this need to, like, I couldn't breathe. I got to get out of here. But then I had these children, and I thought, I can't just up and leave. They've already lost their dad and the stability, and I can't move them away from here. But after sticking it out for, almost a year and a half, almost 2 years, it just seemed like it was never going to be, there would always feel like something critical in my life was missing. And that sadness was just too heavy for me to deal with.
That's sad to hear. So you moved with your second husband, and so how did that relationship end?
Well, it was actually an entire decade of terrible emotional abuse. Once we moved to the mountain, the minute we got there, we had our first daughter, and my daughter Tatum with special needs. She came down with cancer, a rare form of connective tissue cancer. So here we up on this mountain. I've got four kids who are grieving. Now one has cancer and special needs, a baby who, like, was the worst baby. I love her now, but she was the worst baby in the world. And he was nowhere to be found. Nowhere. Not physically, not emotionally, nothing. And, I just kept sticking it out. And I became a version of myself that I didn't recognize. I have my entire life been a pleaser. I have always tried to help everyone else. Then, this nurturer, hated conflict, hated yelling, you know. And all of a sudden, I became this person that was like constantly exploding and angry. And, I would kick him out and then I would beg him back. And I just became someone I didn't recognize. And the worse it got, the more I sought counseling to try and fix myself. I thought, I must be broken. Like what I went through with Tate and what I went through with Colin, like it must have broken me. And he was more than happy to continue on that path of telling me, yes, you are broken. There's nothing wrong with me. You need to fix yourself. And really used it as a tool to keep me quiet, to keep me from asking for things. If he came home late and I was upset about it, he would take my furniture and smash it in front of me. There was just always this big scene that would be so overwhelming to me that it would automatically make me feel like, don't do that again. I can honestly say that there was no true physical violence, besides a couple of times pretending to choke me, but the sheer fear of the intensity of his anger and the way that he would explode would jar me enough to make me be quiet until the next time I would explode, because what he would do was so unimaginable, just abandoning me and not helping with the kids, the lying, the cheating, the gambling. And so it went on for 10 years. We did separate once for real for 6 months. And, where I was a runner, he used to run about 10 miles every other day. I couldn't get out of bed. I was crippled, literally. They thought I had fibromyalgia. I was taking medication because I think I was just swallowing so much and just trying to be so controlled that it literally felt like my bones were breaking. But within 6 months of him leaving, I was back to running. I was back to feeling like myself. But then he came back and said, like, well, okay, if you really want to get back together and you're going to keep begging me. And I wasn't. But at that point, we had two little kids, and I felt bad. I felt guilty because he was doing so poorly, and here I was doing great. And I almost felt like I did at the start, like, okay, well, we're gonna heal together. We're gonna make this work. And I took him right back. So it did take, several times of us separating, once for real and another time, just these constant blow ups all the time. And we divorced in 2023, but not without a fight, not without being lied about. He came for me saying that I was a drug addict and alcoholic, that I was a terrible mom, that I didn't make the kids go to school. Just really everything you can imagine he came for me with. So it did take me many years and my whole savings to break free. But I'm happy to say now, he doesn't have any rights to my children. It was dangerous for him to see them, and it's hopefully in our past for at least now. I feel like he's a little bit of Friday the 13th, Jason. I always envision him popping back up at some point, but for now it's quiet.
That's quite the story, Julie. Like you've really been through a lot. And, how did you, I think I'm just thinking sort of to the final time when the relationship was over. How were you able to accept that? Right. A lot of people in your situation are not able to do it. When did you finally stop begging for him to come back?
Well, I'd love to say that I just had enough and I cared enough about myself. But the reality was, as brutal as he was to me, he was terrible to my children, specifically my son, one of my sons. And after that 6 month separation, when I let him back in, it was Easter. And I remember my younger son saw him in my kitchen and he came to me and said, like, why did you let him back in? Why are you doing this? He's threatened to kill you. He's threatened to kill me. He's lived in my bedroom. I don't come out of my bedroom. I'm afraid of him. I've lost my childhood. And it wasn't immediate, but when he said that to me, it was for the first time that I had to really examine, look in the mirror. And, if I couldn't get out of it for myself, or I thought that I somehow deserved the treatment, if I wanted to say I was a good mom, which I like to believe I am, I had to accept that I wasn't being a good mom and that my children deserve better, even if I didn't think I did. And that was really the beginning of the end. And I didn't care at that point what it took. I just wasn't ever going to put him back in that situation, or anyone really in our house.
I mean, so how is family and I mean, they eventually must have heard, even though you weren't in the same city anymore. How did they take the news of that?
Well, I mean, that was partially why I stayed too. You know, After we left, I tend to be someone that when I walk away, I walk away, and I just pretend that whatever it was doesn't exist, and I don't have to deal with it. And a lot of that went on with my family, my friends. I kind of said, okay, well, you guys are in my past now, and everything about them reminded me of sadness. So I really stopped communicating. And the worse it got between the two of us, the more I stopped communicating. The problem was that we grew up in the same town together, my second husband as well. And so while I was cutting people out of my life and trying to focus, sitting up on this mountain with all these children and illness and babies, he was actually running back home and telling everyone how crazy I was. He was painting a picture of me as, that I was crazy, I was insane, I was broken. He was recording me. He was sending my text messages out in chains to people. And although I knew that he was doing it to some extent, I don't think I ever fully understood the true maniacal nature of what he was doing and the insidiousness with which
Yeah.
he was trying to paint me. So I constantly was on this apology tour. When I would run into people from my past, I would spend the entire time trying to prove to them that I wasn't crazy. Like, I'm not crazy. I'm this, and I'm so nice. Look at how nice I am.
Mhm.
And I'm sure from the outside, I did appear crazy. I was doing crazy things. I'm not going to lie. But I think had anybody known um, the true torture, emotional torture, and mental torture that I was suffering through, I should hope that they wouldn't have formed those opinions of me. Again, I don't know what they think of me. When push came to shove and I had to really walk away from that relationship, I also had to say, I'm going to have to be okay losing friends, losing family, moving along, and dropping the ball on that. If at some point those relationships can be repaired, they can, there's going back, and then that will have to be in the future. But for now, it was just distractions that were keeping me stuck in a really abusive situation because I was so afraid of losing things that, quite honestly, after the fact, looking back, if they were that fragile, I didn't have them to begin with.
That's a fair point, precisely for someone that's thinking about leaving a relationship and they're scared, paralyzed by uncertainty, guilt, like just a lot of these feelings that you've also, talked about. What would your advice be to them as someone that's already walked past?
I think that if you continue to try and make something work and it is not working, and you've tried pretty much all that you can, there's a design in it. I could have stayed in that relationship for the rest of my life, and I probably could have navigated it because when you're in abusive situations, what you think is this is controllable. This is predictably controllable. I'm going to
Wow.
have this cycle. He's going to be mad. You play it out in your head as if you can manage it. And if I can manage it, it won't get any worse. But the problem is that the more you manage, the more they try and break it down. So these relationships don't get any better. And you will have to lose what you think you might walk away from family, you might walk away from friends, you might lose, the things that you think you value. But on the other side of it, there is absolutely no substitute for feeling safe, for feeling secure, and for no longer having the unknown just hanging over you, because that's what it is. It's this constant what's coming at me next. You can't see it until you get on the other side of it. But all the things that you're so afraid of losing, you either don't have, they're illusions, or they're the very things that are keeping you stuck.
That's something to reflect on for sure. I get a lot of sense of courage there and just doing what you have to do and just working yourself through that. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think I think whenever you're faced with any situation, it's so easy to feel like you have to do it all at once. Like you walk into a room and it's in chaos and you have to organize stuff and you walk in and literally you're like, nope. And you walk back out and shut the door because the whole thought of doing it is just too much. But what I try and do in life now is open up the door, go, okay, I'm just going to do this little section here, get it done, walk out and say, okay, I'm going to tackle the rest of it tomorrow. And I think when you're in an abusive situation, you have to find those things that give you power. Whether that means today I'm going to work on my resume so that I can get a better job, so that I can feel secure. Or today I'm not going to chase him. I'm just going to let that go. Whatever it is that you feel, just make that little milestone for yourself every day, work toward it. And pretty soon, all those little things that seem very little, they add up to something really big. And once you see, wait a second, I can pay the bills, or wait a second, I can, clean out half of this room, then you're like, I'm going to keep going with this because if I can do that, then I know I can do the rest of it.
Absolutely. Are there steps that a person can take even before leaving the relationship to maybe set themselves up for success after the relationship? I'm just, trying to think in terms of preparation. So there's somebody out there that's thinking, I need to make this move. I don't have the courage right now. Is there anything they should be doing while they're still in it, just kind of preparing to leave?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think it's very important to find a third party. Don't want to make people paranoid, but if you keep going back to the people that know you and know the situation, or people that you've talked to before, that either become very numb to hearing what you're saying, but they've
Mm.
also decided that they know how far to push you. And when they push you too far, you start defending. So they stop even trying and they back away. Getting a third party involved, whether that means a counselor, whether that means even just going to sit down with a lawyer. It's $100 to sit down and have that conversation, just to say, like, I don't know if I'm here yet. What would I need? What does this look like on paper? They're not going to charge you but your consultation fee. Going to a counselor and saying, am I making this up? Am I able to? I see this. What is your take on it? I think sometimes, a lot of the women that I talk to and I counsel, they say to me, like, well, I couldn't have, because they come to me, we'll have that conversation. They'll say, like, I couldn't have done it without you. And I always say, no, you definitely could have. The only thing that I did was give you a mirror so that you could see who you actually were, not who you've become, because you are a shell when you go into these things. You lose who you are, you lose your identity. So taking small steps like finding a third party, maybe join a running club, find somebody outside of your sphere, to remember that there are other people out there that you can meet. You don't have to stay with the same crowd. If you do lose friends, you can make friends. I would definitely talk to a financial person. Just because you're living on a budget right now and you're not putting money away, that probably doesn't mean that if you like really talk to someone, start putting a little bit of money away, that it
Mhm.
won't become, then, and as a woman, I think that's important anyway. We rarely put away money for ourselves because it almost feels as if we don't believe in our marriage, or we're being selfish, but my first marriage was everything I could have wanted for, but things don't turn out the way that we want them to sometimes. And it's always good to have an exit plan. It's always good to have something to fall back on. And I think when you become too reliant on something, you stop looking for options to make yourself feel fulfilled and accomplished. But in a lot of these situations, when you leave and you're on the other side of it, that you figure out that you were doing it alone anyway. You just didn't see it.
Thanks, Jill. Those are some nice tips for sure. But yeah, you mentioned your foundation. So let's kind of talk about the work you do within the foundation and how you help, women in these situations.
Yeah. So when I lost my first husband, as I said, we had a large community. We were very blessed. They held fundraisers for us. So I don't know that I would have made it through those times without them. When he died, I remember saying to him, like, your death, something good has got to come out of this. And then, of course, I jumped into the second situation, got distracted. Coming out of the divorce, I I lost all my savings, and I recognized that a huge reason why women stay is because there's no financial help. There's no support system. There's two different support systems. Either you have money or you have to have nothing. Because if you're in between there, there's nothing out there for you because you're not eligible because you're not poor enough. So when I first started the organization, I was like, I'm going to provide mortgage. I'm going to, I wanted to do it all. And I still do. But what I found was there are organizations out there that you don't know about, whether they're church groups or whether there's little organizations that take care of a piece of what you need. And I kind of got this from my daughter because she's a sophomore now in college. But when she went for a scholarship, everyone's looking for the full ride. I want a full ride. Well, she didn't approach it that way. What she did was she went in and said, I'm getting 2,000 here. I'm going to get 2,500 here. So when I entered the world of the charity, people would say to me, so and so will pay their first month's rent. And this company will do this. And I thought, well, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. If these companies are out there, that's amazing, but I didn't know about them. So, what we're trying to do in the infancy of our organization is get a landscape of what is out there for women who come to us. So we can say, fill this out, fill this out. So you're not filling out forms, finding out you're rejected for them, because right there, you're like, forget it. We want to know exactly what you're eligible for. So when you come to us, we know what you have to fill out. We have networking there, and then whatever isn't covered is what we're trying to focus on. So getting just the lay of the land, and then figuring out those things like, a huge part is legal fees. Like those are really hard to get covered. And when you go to get a divorce, you have to write a check for $2,500, whether you have it or not, just to like retain them. So you end up putting it on a credit card. And then in 2 months, you don't have money for mortgage. We're trying to tackle it on a, networking side, to help them find jobs, get financial planning. Because when you hit crisis, you don't even know what you need. And then you hit it and you don't have time to research where to find anything that you need. So we're trying to give them a roadmap so that it just makes them a lot easier and they can focus on their children and the things that really need to be focused on at a time when you don't have that time to do it.
That is incredibly helpful. And I don't even think I could add to that because you're right. Like there's such a gap in, well, in various services. And I know within the legal world, we recognize sort of that gap in legal services. And now there's a greater awareness that there's also, emotional needs that are not kind of being catered to, and, starting to be that awareness that we need to look at that emotional side. But you also step in with the practical, right? Like, these people need to have their mortgages paid. Who knows, without, support coming in, maybe there's groceries that are not being provided. And it's just nice that there are organizations like yours, Julie, that would provide information to people. So, in the description of these, in the podcast and in the video, we're going to put your contact information so that people can reach out to you and can get additional information to move forward. Because yes, we're here today kind of talking about women. It's one thing to say, well, we want to empower women to leave. And yes, you've given us a lot from the mental strength part and just, planning to leave, actually living. Some people stay back because of the children, but you've shared your light bulb moment when you noticed that it was even worse for the children for you to stay than to leave. And, so that is all great. But I just love that you're also empowering people after, when they're on the other side, they're not just out there and alone and not knowing what to do. And now, maybe regretting their decision, but you're there to help them. And, whether they regret their decision or not, that's still part of the journey and that's fine. But just having organizations like yours to assist with the practical things that have to come after I think it's phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. When you say regretting your decision, I actually have never met anyone who regretted that decision. To
Oh,
anyone out
that's
there feeling that
interesting.
way, yeah, anyone out there feeling that way, my take on it is if you leave somebody
Yeah.
and you divorce them, you can get remarried. Don't stay because it's final. Nothing in life is final unless you say it's final and you close that door.
Yeah.
So, you know, yes, there are times when you will regret because you are like, okay, now I'm breadwinner. But when you get on the other side of it and you feel it's like losing, 20-pound weight that you've been carrying, it's such, most people wonder why they didn't do it sooner. And the reason why is because it does have to get worse before it gets better. But in saying that, what you gain on the other side of it, you can't live that life that way forever. The body does keep score, and it will catch up to you to a place where you'll have to leave. And if you wait until you'll have to leave, then there's going to be a bigger mess to clean up.
Yeah.
And in emotional abuse, it's just a matter of time before it gets physical. It always does. If you stick around long enough because you feel like you're not being physically abused, there's a good likelihood that it will just take once, and once will be enough. And we see how many crime TV documentaries
Yep.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
So
No.
don't wait until it's a situation where you have to flee your home and you don't have options. If you're even feeling like maybe this is not the place for you, if you want to protect your children, protect yourself. It's not selfish. It's not being pessimistic. It's having a plan to make sure that you're safe.
Wow, this I feel like you answered the question I was going to ask you in closing anyway, because I was going to ask you what advice you'd give to someone that's feeling trapped. But before I even go there, I just want to talk a little bit about your book, because Julie, you do have a book, right? Can you tell me a
I
little
do.
bit about that?
So I have one that I wrote. It's called Notes from a Blackberry. And it's about my daughter's illness. When my daughter, like I said, we traveled around the United States for 4 years trying to figure out what was wrong with her. And right as she was starting to soar, Colin fell ill. So as I would take him to chemo, I had a BlackBerry. That's why it's called Notes from a BlackBerry, where I'd hope that we would reconnect. And, he was so sick that I started just writing. I don't know what impulsed me, but I wanted to write our story, Tatum's story. And I think a huge part was one, Tatum's story was so unimaginable. It's like a roller coaster ride. And secondly, I think that I knew realistically that my children would probably never meet Colin. So I wanted them to know him. I wanted them to know us because, I'd known him since third grade. So I wrote it. And what I would do is I would write it while we were there and I emailed it back to myself. And then at the end, I pieced it all together, but I let it sit on my laptop for 14 years. And it wasn't until I got divorced or I think in the midst of the divorce, that I found the courage to read it because I had never read it. And it was a long book. I got to the end of it and I was like, crazy stuff didn't even happen yet. And at that moment, I sat down, I wrote my second book, which is soon to come out, called From Blackberries to Thorns. And it's a continuation of the first story heading into the second. And I like to think, hopefully, it'll help people who are feeling alone in thinking the things that we all think. You always think you know what you'd do or how you would feel until you hit unimaginable circumstances, and then things become unimaginable. So, it's the story of a caregiver. The first story is. The second one is escaping, what some people might think is a bad decision that you don't see coming. But I just hope it's relatable to people and they see parts of themselves. And if they're able to give me grace and say she did the best she could and kind of see me as the character who is sympathetic, then hopefully they will do the same for themselves and recognize in it the steps that I couldn't see from the outside.
That is nice. Okay, I can't wait for that one. Is there any last thing you just want to share with the listeners, whether it's someone that wants to go through the process or wants to leave a relationship, rather, or someone who wants to work with your foundation or who is just out there and just feeling lost? Like any last words?
I just think that, I used to get so caught up in worrying about what other people thought of me. What are people going to say? What are people going to do? And after all the experiences that I've been through, I think I finally have learned that it doesn't matter what other people have to say about what I've done or my relationship, because I'm the only one that has to live it. And if that's what's keeping you stuck, I will say that although I was so afraid to lose it all, I wake up every day in peace. And my very worst day ever now is 10 times better than my very best day for a decade. And that's the way it happens. It gets worse, but you will literally right now cannot imagine how great things can be if you just take steps to, get out of whatever you feel so stuck in.
Thank you so much, Julie. That is so well said. Thank you for that. And with that, I am going to end this podcast on this note. You've been so generous with your time, Julie. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, your strength, and really your story just reminds us that living a relationship sometimes is probably the greatest success that there can be. I appreciate and respect the work that you're doing. And as I said, would have information on how people can reach out to you. And yes, please go out and check out Julie's books for sure. And yes, thanks again, Julie. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you for having me.